Hello and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Office Space Utilization. We're pleased that you've joined us today. And before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, we have a great lineup of speakers today who will be sharing their insights and expertise on this important subject. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console for your convenience. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Jeff Meads to get the presentation started.
Great, thank you, Amy. And thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Jeff Meads, and I head up the real estate advisory practice here at Moss Adams. Our real estate practice is really focused on helping our clients develop and implement real estate strategies that support their businesses. Just a quick few examples of that is currently we're working on about 8 lease transactions through Northern California. We've got about 4 other transactions that are active in buy and sell for our clients. We have roughly $10 million in construction management projects we have underway right now, and another $10 million of construction projects in design mode. So you can see we've got a very line of support going on for our clients. So just to kind of make some headlines there, and with that, I am going to introduce you to our other panel of experts. So we're fortunate to have Jonathan Bahe, is Principal and Corporate Market Leader for NBBJ. We have John Anthony, who is Executive Vice President, Managing Director, and Shareholder with Mathews. We have Paul Picciani, who is Senior Vice President, Managing Director, and Shareholder with Mathews as well. And with that little bit of experience, I'm going to let Jonathan start in and explain a little more about what he does and his experience.
Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. As Jeff said, my name is Jonathan Bahe. I'm with NBBJ, which is a global architecture and design firm. I'm in our Seattle office, but lead our corporate practice across the country, working closely with my colleagues in 8 offices here in the US and 4 additional offices overseas. Most of my work is with end users, and so thinking through this really dynamic world that we're going to be talking about for the next hour. And what does the future of hybrid work look like? What's the future of work in general look like? And how do we design beautiful spaces that are going to draw people back to the office and create those innovative, collaborative cultures that we all are looking for in our organizations today. So really excited to be with you all and for this conversation.
John, please go next.
Thanks, Jeff. John Anthony. I'm with Kidder Mathews, full service commercial real estate firm here on the West Coast. For 25 years, been leading a team of brokers in the downtown LA office, largely focused on the leasing and sale of commercial office buildings in greater downtown Los Angeles, not exclusively, but mostly. So a lot of my perspective today will be on the landlord side, on the seller side, and the challenges we're facing in leasing and moving office space in this market.
Paul?
Thanks, Jeff, and good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Picciani. Similar to John, I am a shareholder with Kidder Mathews, and I run our downtown San Francisco office. My practice focus is primarily on the tenant side, representing office tenants and buyers throughout San Francisco, as well as in the East Bay and in Oakland, with a particular focus on financial services, professional services, nonprofits, and foundations. I'm currently involved in 20 plus projects for clients. And so despite some of the things you may have heard about the Bay Area and the real estate market, there are still things going on here, albeit we certainly have our challenges.
That's great. Hey, thanks all three of you, and looking forward to the conversation to come. With that, Amy, I'm going to turn it back to you to go through our first polling question.
All right, thank you. So our first polling question is, in which region are the majority of your offices located? And your options are West, Southwest, Midwest, Southeast, or Northeast. And to respond, you're going to click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. And for those of you having difficulty finding the polling questions, they are located on the slides we're presenting, so make sure you have your slide window open. All right, here are the results.
Well, these results are pretty interesting. So we've got, just for the audience, roughly 53% are designating themselves as West region. We've got roughly 15% in the Southwest. And then the rest of this is spread out through the Midwest, Southeast, and Northeast, but actually pretty good representation across the country, which is really good and excited. And obviously we've got panelists here that do work on the West Coast, but obviously we make sure that we're involved and understand what's going on across the country. And with that setting up our conversation, I think we should get going. And I think the first question is, and I'll turn it to John, is, John, what are you seeing from a landlord's perspective for trends in the office market today?
Well, it's really a tale of two tenants. We've got our tenant that is still trying to figure out their post-pandemic footprint, how they're coping with work from home and hybrid work and getting employees back to the office. They're still trying to figure out long-term what that will look like for them, what their space needs are, how they're adjusting to the new realities of the workplace, the new realities of their particular industry, and it really goes, it's industry to industry. Those tenants that are still trying to answer all those questions, work with their architect, work with their furniture vendor, really get a handle and a picture on what they need long-term, and also decide what their long-term strategy is for their particular business. Well, they're behind the 8 ball, and they're coming to you looking for short-term solutions. They want to do, 1-year renewals. They'll even go month to month. They're looking to just keep things status quo, usually at their current rent, while they figure out all those, the answers to all those questions. The other side of that equation is the tenant that's done all that homework, drawn that line in the sand, made those decisions, worked with their whole architectural construction design team, and really mapped out what their future is. they then sit in a really, really advantageous position of being able to go to landlords and being one of the few tenants willing to commit to a long-term lease right now, and thereby having a whole option of flexibility in their lease that we hadn't seen before. So a lot of concessions, certainly aggressive build-out packages, things like early lease terminations are on the table, things like expansion options are on the table. They can build in a lot of flexibility, and most importantly, for most of them, capture really good economics that they lock in right now on a 7-10-year lease, because there's so few companies that have gotten to that part of the decision-making process where they're willing to do a long-term lease. I would say it's about an 80-20 split that we're seeing right now between those looking to still do short-term, let's figure it out decisions versus those that have done the homework and are ready to commit long-term.
Yeah, it's great to break that down in those two sections, right? Because I think that's very appropriate for today, you know, short-term, long-term perspective. And the really good news is we have the tenant rep side. So Paul, it'd be great to hear your take from the leasing market on tenants and how they're approaching short-term and long-term decisions.
Sure thing, Jeff. I would echo everything that John says. About 80% of tenants are kicking the can down the road and doing short-term projects because they're not sure what the future is going to hold. And then perhaps 20% are doing the deep work that it takes to think through what they may need. And that's with their architect, as John said, their furniture vendor. And I would also add their broker, who can give them insight into which parts of the city that they may be operating in are doing better or worse, and which landlords are doing better or worse. Because there's really been, as John mentioned, this concept of the tale of two tenants, and it's almost a tale of two cities. The flight to quality is very, very real, and the best buildings in most downtowns across the country, from the research that I've seen, are doing reasonably well in the face of rising vacancy. And the worst buildings, the buildings that have not been well maintained, the buildings that are least amenitized, they're the buildings that are not doing well, and those landlords may be on the financial ropes. And so, starting the process early, what a lot of folks, I think, have not perhaps been caught off guard by, is they've been approaching their impending lease expirations the same way they always have, which is, okay, well, we're a 3,000 to 5,000 foot tenant. We'll start thinking about this, 6 to 12 months out. We're a 5 to 15, 20,000 foot tenant. We'll start thinking about this, 12 to 18 and change months out. You need to start thinking about it much sooner, because you need to do the design charrettes with your architect to understand how the space is going to lay out to most effectively support what your work style is going to be going forward. And then you need time to evaluate all of your options in the market. And you need time also to build support in your employee base behind the direction that you're going to go in, because nobody wants to wake up the next day and say, oh, by the way, we've moved, and now there's only one desk or one seat for every 10 employees, as a radical example. And you want to have time to build in that support. And so I would probably, whatever time frame you thought you needed pre-COVID, I would double that, if not 2.5 it, in terms of advanced planning time.
Yeah, time has a different meaning today. I'm not sure if you folks are saying it, but it seems like it is 2x on any timeline that you had before to what it is now today. So it's interesting to give that comment, because I think it's very, very applicable. With Jonathan, what design trends are companies employing to attract employees back into the office? Because that's the other side of the equation, right? We can have landlords ready to do deals. We can have tenant rep brokers like Paul ready to accommodate and make sure those business needs are taken care of. But at the end of the day, it comes back to the company and what they're doing to try to bring tenants back into the office. Are you seeing any trends out there that are taking hold?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Maybe just building on what Paul was saying, certainly one of the biggest trends that we're seeing is that, our workplace strategy and real estate strategy teams are are really busy trying to help clients figure out the answer to this question. And the reality is that the answer is different for every client. What's the right amount of real estate? What's the right workplace solution? How should that be thought through from a strategy perspective before we even put pen to paper and start thinking about what's that mean for design, right? And so to Paul's point, the more we understand those key questions early on, they ultimately create designs that are really relevant to whatever that individual company's needs are and the way that they function. And, so to get to your question exactly, Jeff, the answer is, what are the trends? Well, it really depends, right? Like everything else. The things that people are looking for are relatively consistent, but they're not necessarily about design with a capital D, right? We're certainly seeing an increase in more communal spaces, particularly in industries that weren't doing a lot of that before. So law firms are a good example, right? We're seeing a lot more of that front of house hospitality, sort of cafe kind of feel than the more standard, this is my reception area where clients wait, right? Those spaces that folks might sit in, and all of a sudden you say, well, I'm a lawyer and I can sit in a space like that that's not my private office. Like, that's a pretty big shift in organizations. Certainly folks are looking for, just like they were before the pandemic, they're looking for spaces where when they're in, they can focus. They can be on a phone call and not disrupt their neighbors. That doesn't mean private offices. We're not building a lot of private offices. But it means that those things that employees were really asking for before and saying, my open workplace doesn't work for me. Now employers are finally realizing, wow, I better give them the things that they need to make it work for them to get them back to the office. But the yin and yang of that hasn't changed, right? Employees are largely saying they want the same things. They want spaces that are collaborative, that are healthy, where they can learn and be mentored. And I think employers are really coming around in a lot of industries to do that. I think, luckily we've moved away from the days of, free food everywhere and ball pits and slides is the thing that's going to attract people back to the office. It feels like that has finally died a well-deserved death.
Yeah. Are you seeing any difference in layout from companies that are doing more hybrid versus fully back in the office?
Not really. Mostly because it becomes a math exercise and not a design exercise. So a good example, we have a client we're doing a new headquarters for that we started design in March of 2020. Seemed like a great time to kick off design for a new headquarters. They had a strategy that they were committed to about what they believed the future was going to be. And the pandemic was certainly a large bump in that timeline, but it didn't change their strategy about the way they were thinking about the future of work, which was a hybrid, not everybody's going to be in the office every day kind of experience. And so it's really through providing that balance of when folks are in the office, what kind of spaces do they need? And if your culture is the kind of culture that says, when folks are in the office, they're sitting at a traditional desk, well, that's very different than saying, well, why are people coming into the office? Am I going to make somebody come into the office, face their commute, to have them sit at a desk for 8 hours a day and just work? Like, they might as well do that at home, right? They're coming into the office because they want to collaborate and work with others. They want to meet, they want to learn. And so the kind of spaces that we create to foster that kind of environment are really consistent, regardless if they're in 2 days a week to do that or 5 days a week to do that, right? It's really understanding that culture and why are people coming to the office, and then we can create design solutions, furniture solutions that support that.
Great. Okay. Well, listen, I think we've done a good job of kind of walking through some of the current trends and what we're seeing in the markets right now. And at this time, I'd like to turn it back over to Amy and have her walk us through the next two polling questions before we get into our strategy and lease negotiation sections.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. So the second polling question is, what is your current work model? Fully remote, fully in office, hybrid, it's up to our employees' discretion, hybrid, 1 to 2 days in office mandatory, or hybrid, 2 to 4 days in office mandatory. And while you're responding, just a reminder that if you would like to receive CPE credit for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions. All right, here are the results for the first one. Any comments on this, Jeff, before we move on to the next one?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, from our audience, we're still looking at, looks like people are moving to that, 3-4 day in office being mandatory. So I think we've, if this survey was done, this time last year, you probably would have seen still of most people working from doing remote work. So it's nice to see for us that spend our lives in cities that we're starting to see companies put more emphasis on coming back into the office. So I think that's encouraging and something to note. And I think, we'll see how these questions evolve over the next, for the rest of this year. But I think we are definitely starting to see a trend working towards more days in the office. They're not ready to go 5 days a week yet, but we're starting to see a trend that's asking for more days in the office.
All right, and then our third polling question is in-person collaboration important to your organization? Yes, no, or depends on the situation? And this one should go pretty quickly. And as you respond, I just want to remind you, you do have the option to submit questions for the presenters using the Q&A window. And we should have some time towards the end of the hour to address these questions. So feel free to submit them as we go. All right, here are the results.
Yeah, so it's majority of our respondents are saying yes, that collaboration is important. We're at like 54% of respondents. And so again, I think this is, tied to that, that last question of how many, are you working remotely or companies starting to require you to come back in the office? And I think this is, I think because people still want that collaboration, I think that's going to drive that, drive companies wanting to have their folks back in the office more days a week. So again, that's an interesting note there. Still, decent percentage at 39% saying that depends on the situation. But it's encouraging to see the collaboration part. Because I think that again just ties back to the concept of, how much more are we going to start to see companies, and employees want to be back in the office, and at what point do we settle as at 3 days a week, 4 days a week, 5 days a week? But we're starting to see that trend go up. So great input, and really appreciate everybody taking the time to fill it out. Okay, so back to the panelists. I think now we spend a little time on thinking through some of the strategies for tenant and owners. And one of the questions I've got is, what considerations should companies make when they are creating their office space strategy, right? Are there differences in short-term versus long-term considerations? And I'd like to throw that back to Paul and let him walk through kind of the conversations he's having with tenants. He mentioned before about short-term, long-term, but maybe get a more specific, Paul, and help identify some of those key components of strategy.
Sure. Yeah, I saw a very helpful set of 3 questions recently from the furniture company Hayworth, which Jonathan is familiar with. And the first question was, number one, why do we do what we do? In other words, define the organization's core purpose. Number 2 is, how could we best do it? And then the last is, what needs to change in our workplace in order to achieve that? And I thought that those were 3 very concise questions that every organization should be asking themselves. because the office space isn't the purpose of the corporation. The corporation's purpose is the purpose of the corporation, and an office space plays a supporting role. And so to the extent that the office space is supporting that objective, and you're able to achieve maximum innovation and maximum productivity and maximum profitability from your office space, then that's great. If you're not, then you need to look at what kind of a role office space is playing in that. And I would go back to, in terms of strategy, the key element is starting early. The real estate market is very, very fluid in all cities around the country. Certainly, we're all familiar with some of the difficulties that coastal cities, including San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, going to the Midwest, are having. At the same time, other markets are doing great. The Albany market is very stable. The Albuquerque market is very stable. In Nashville, a colleague of mine recently returned from site visits there, and he said that there were 44 construction cranes in downtown Nashville. And so, it depends on the area of the country that you're operating in, but starting early, engaging with your architect and bringing in your broker sooner rather than later to help talk through which buildings and which landlords are going to be most interested in supporting what you're doing is helpful. The other, just to touch on, folks that are maybe kicking the can or doing an early renewal, or they just want to do a short-term renewal, getting an understanding of what's going on in your own building from your broker is pretty critical. And I'll use an example. I won't identify the building. It's a core building here in downtown San Francisco that currently looks on paper like it's performing extremely well. The market here is 25 to 30+% vacant. When you add on sublease space, it probably gets a little bit higher. And this building is on paper about 13% vacant, meaning 87% of the building is leased. What's not necessarily obvious to everybody is that 20% there's a very large block of space consisting of 22% of the building that's about to be vacated at the end of July. And so starting in August, that building's vacancy rate is going to shoot up to 30+%. And so that's something for every tenant to be aware of. It's not just generally what's going on in the market, but get very micro on what's going on in your building. And that way you can start to engage in early conversations with your landlord to talk about what options might be possible for growth or contraction within the building, and look at your options outside of the building.
I think his mic's off.
Yeah.
That's the danger of clicking my mute button. I can't talk when I want. So my next question, I'm gonna flip it to Jonathan, but after that, I'm gonna want John to weigh in on the landlord side, and I may rephrase this a little bit different for John, but for Jonathan, I spent a lot of time reviewing drawings and designs and construction with people like Salesforce and Uber and Square and the like, and all the tech companies you think of San Francisco, where all that time of doing that was focused on culture, right? How they wanted their employees to be in, the different things they would do to design, the talk of creating that culture. As you look at that now, how are you seeing companies still talk about culture, and how do they create that in a remote workforce?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I was fascinated by the poll results. I mean, and not to draw a trend line or anything from the results, but it shows that all of the folks just on this call, we got about 200 people here today. There is no one answer for anyone, right? And presumably some of the organizations here are still trying to figure out what their next step is. And that's why they're in, one of those buckets. Others have made a commitment to one of those buckets. But it's fascinating to see that split, right? It's, roughly distributed into fifths, right? I think that shows that, from a culture perspective, there is no one answer. It's about what's right for the individual culture. And, despite lots of news, I mean, the U.S. economy has still remained very strong. Unemployment numbers are still really low. The competition for talent is still really high. And so those drivers that we saw before the pandemic are still true today, right? We need, maybe more than ever, we need incredibly talented people who understand our culture and why it's different than the culture of another organization, why those folks are going to be a good fit for us to help drive our business into the future. All those key drivers have really remained true. And again, if nothing else, given some of the economic headwinds that we see are even more important than they were before, right? To find those really top performers and a top performer that's going to fit your organization. So I think that the notion of designing spaces or companies focusing on strategies that support their culture, I think that's a key cornerstone of workplace and why we come together. I think the thing that's shifted a little bit there, though, is that the question of employee wellness or employee health and what employees need and how that fits into company culture, at times those have been at odds with each other. In successful organizations that are healthy, those things are really well aligned, but in some organizations there's a tension there. And I think what we're seeing is some reconciliation of that tension, to say that maybe I don't need to work 60-hour weeks to be successful at XYZ tech company, right? Maybe that kind of hard driving metric of success isn't the end all be all. And, employees still have a lot of power in the market today. And so I think we're going to continue to see that tension exist. And, it's showing up in some of the results of, I would say a gross generalization. Employers want people back in the office. Employees are saying, I don't know if I want to be in, right? And that tension there is, again, between employer and employee. But as Paul said, geographically, very different. Organizationally, right? We're seeing smaller companies. Most of them are back in the office more. It's really the big companies that are struggling with this challenge. So maybe a long way of saying, Jeff, culture, right? All day long, right? The old saying, culture eats strategy every day, right? It's, culture is super important.
Well, John, on the landlord side, which, I've spent over 30 years as a landlord rep working with some large institutional real estate owners, and always trying to figure out what are we going to do to be at a better advantage than the building next door, right? Does that mean adding the bike storage? Does it mean adding showers? Does it mean a fitness room? All those conversations, things that we went through. Again, really to try to attract the right tenants, but it was also just to be in a position better than our competitive set. How's that conversation now with landlords? How are they looking at this? And I think you're probably right when you said originally the long-term, short-term view from a tenant perspective. But I think that's got to also resonate with the landlord side, right? I think the landlords have got are probably discussing short-term, long-term, and I'd love to hear from your perspective how that conversation's going.
Those conversations are vastly different depending upon the type of building you have and where it's located. So if you're sitting pretty with a Class A, highly amenitized building in a good solid market with a good solid rent roll, it's easy to take a look at those tenant amenities that were so hot and so in demand, such as additional vehicle charging stations, to on-site gyms, to on-site meeting areas, to the bike parking. All of that's easy money to spend when your rent roll is healthy and you don't have a loan maturing in the next few years. Now those folks that are sitting in, let's say, your more B plus type buildings that don't have those amenities readily handy, and then they have retail on the ground floor that is either closed or suffered, they're having a much different decision. They're looking at perhaps adaptive reuse. They might think about going from office to residential. So it really depends, especially here in LA. If you look at downtown LA versus a suburb such as Pasadena, Burbank, Century City, West LA, vastly different conversations across the board. The flight to the suburbs is a real thing. And like I said, those type A trophy buildings don't have loans maturing are in better shape and able to invest some of the money into the amenities. It's those B type buildings that are still trying to catch up, and now they're catching up when there's less demand than there's ever been. So it really is a long-term strategic decision. There's a lot of those being made right now.
Great. Well,
And
thank
Jeff,
you. Yeah,
maybe Jeff,
go
if I
ahead.
could just build on that, I think that, to John's point, the things that seemed like nice to haves before the pandemic are now must haves, right? So if you haven't already done the bike room, the fitness center, or all those things, it's hard, right? Because now tenants have a lot more options that already have all of those things. And so the baseline has just shifted, right? So if you don't, it's sort of, it's a much tougher conversation from a tenant side. I think that the thing actually that we're seeing, maybe two splits. One is landlords trying to figure out, how do I reposition, reimagine this building, but in a different way, right? Leading up to the pandemic, there was a lot of sort of lipstick on a pig. I'm just going to dump some money into finishes in the lobby. It's going to look and feel new, but I didn't really change it, right? There's a lot of landlords really looking at the way they can reimagine their office buildings in some, still with office use, but in really exciting ways. The other maybe more nuanced shift that we're seeing is around some of those meeting and amenity spaces that buildings provide, and the technology in them, right? So for a long time, landlords have said, hey, here's this big room, you can rent it out, you can use it for meetings. But now tenants are saying, well, it's great, but it doesn't have any technology in it. What am I going to do? I can't have a big meeting if it doesn't have technology. If I can't use Teams or Zoom in your meeting room, it's sort of pointless for me, right? And so landlords are trying to figure out that piece of the puzzle as well. And so I think, to John's point, depending where that landlord is in the mix, the ways they're thinking about those investments are very different. Some of these buildings, some of these landlords are in a tough spot, and I think it's going to get, unfortunately, worse before it gets better in that sort of overall macro market.
Well, Paul, I liked your, in your discussion about, helping tenants plan and create that strategy, right? I think the understanding of the short-term, long-term makes a lot of sense, but it's still hard for tenants to really project long-term right now, right? But what types of things, would you guide a tenant as they build strategy? What would be some of the key points you'd want them to focus on from a leasing perspective, long term, right? I think we understand short term. That means you're basically just holding in place as is. Long term means that you've got something in place and you're ready to go, and that gives you the ability to go and negotiate longer term deals with landlords. But what are some of the key things that you think tenants need to identify in that long term strategy component?
Well, I would say first, understand your current lease and what over your current term has worked well and what has not worked well. Because as John mentioned early in the conversation, tenants have substantial negotiating leverage right now. And so being able to, if you're able to, even if you're only able to commit short term, but certainly if you're able to commit to something longer, to a 5 or 10 plus year lease, you have a lot of negotiating leverage with landlords for not just perhaps the amenities that you'd want in the building or what you'd want them to do for your space, but for expansion options, contraction options, early termination options, renewal options, whether or not it's fair market or perhaps a discount to fair market in a renewal situation, expanded subleasing rights, perhaps not as much sharing a profit with the landlord if you end up having to sublease the space. If you're a good credit tenant, one of the things that certainly I always do when I am presenting offers to landlords is I will include very on in the process the tenant's financials so that they can understand that this tenant is a good credit tenant and operating from a position of financial strength, because that is very, very attractive to landlords, particularly today. The other thing to be absolutely critically sure about is, as I mentioned earlier, is what is your landlord, what is their financial condition? How much equity do they have in the building? How much debt do they have in the building? Is their loan turning over? And a good broker will be able to pull that information up relatively quickly so you can get an understanding of what's going on in your building. And making sure that you have a subordination, non-disturbance, and attornment agreement that the landlord pays for to make sure that your lease will still be valid once if they do happen to lose the building. And you have to keep in mind, particularly if you're looking to commit to something like we talked earlier, 5, 7, 10 years, a lot can change. A lot changed on March 17th, 2020. And nobody saw it, virtually nobody saw it coming. And so we're now 3 and change years past that. We're still struggling through it. There's substantial lag time, particularly in the financial markets in terms of what may or may not happen to a landlord. So building in protections for yourself and protections for your lease and your leasehold interests in a property early on as part of the lease negotiation process is something I strongly recommend. And in fact, have recently, for a law firm project recently, as well as for a major nonprofit project, I did the financial analysis on the buildings that were on the short-er list, and that short-er list suddenly became a short list because a couple of buildings just dropped off because we had real anxiety of whether or not the landlord was going to be able to hold on to the building over the course of the lease term.
That's a really good point. Make sure you've got a landlord that can actually live up to the expectations and what they've done a lease for. But John, I'm just thinking through. I think it's important for everyone, even the audience here, to understand that don't underestimate the landlord's ability to be creative. Right? If you're trying to work through some short-term things, but you still kind of have that long-term strategy that Paul was talking about, I'd like to hear John just explain that. Listen, talk to us as a landlord. Landlords, if there was ever a time to be creative with a landlord, now's the time to do that. And those could form just recasting a lease it into a blend and extend. Maybe they take back some space short-term, expand long-term. But anything that, I'd like to hear John just kind of walk through and encourage how John would give encouragement to being creative right now, because I think that's part of, and that's just part of the market right now. Any thoughts, John?
We're preaching creativity and flexibility to our landlord clients all day long. Never have we seen a time where, you need to have an open mind and often open wallet when approaching each of these lease transactions. As Paul mentioned earlier, we talked about expansion rights, contraction rights, termination rights. Kind of the theme throughout, whether we look at the tenant perspective or the design perspective, it's flexibility. And if you as a landlord can have, oftentimes we have a landlord architect that we work with, we have our property management team, we have our brokerage team, the landlord themselves, sometimes a few steps in between. Everybody's got to be on the same page, and everybody's got to have an open mind to being creative and flexible as they approach each one of these lease negotiations. What we're seeing is you don't get too many options right now. Demand is down, long-term demand is down, construction costs are high. So unless you're sitting there with a building full of spec spaces, it's difficult to lease your shell and your second and your third generation spaces without having a tranche of long-term tenants willing to commit. And that's just not out there right now. So when you're dealing with a tenant that, let's say, has a couple years left on the lease and they've got half their space is unused shadow space, the knee-jerk reaction for a lot of landlords and a lot of landlord brokers are, okay, in this market, we don't want to take any space back before it expires. We don't have the demand to go release that. But you've got to think long-term. That conversation needs to change immediately. And even if they have a few years left on their lease, go in there, roll up your sleeves, work with them on taking that space back in exchange for a long-term commitment. You might be able to lower the amount of TIs you have in their full turnover. That's maybe 2-3 years down the line. But at the very least, you're not adding a problem to your rent roll. You're getting a long-term commitment for a good chunk of your space now. Yes, you're taking back a vacancy, but you have that looming possible huge vacancy in a few years if you sit there and do nothing versus work with them. So again, flexibility, creativity, work as a team. Now more than ever, we see landlords doing it.
Great. Thanks for that feedback. And I think with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Amy for our last polling question of the day.
All right, thank you, Jeff. So the last polling question is, are you planning to enter lease negotiations in the near future? Yes, within the next 3 months. Yes, within the next 6 months. Soon, within the next 12 months. No, or not applicable. And some of you have been asking if this webcast is being recorded so you can share with your team. And the answer is yes, we are recording this. And it will go out via email tomorrow to all registrants.
Excuse me.
Oh, that's it.
Couldn't hit mute button fast enough.
All right, here are the results.
So are you planning to enter lease negotiations in the near future? And 40% basically just said no. So that either means they've already got a stable lease, they don't need to do anything, or they're just, well, again, that's probably meaning their leases aren't up yet, but we've got 17% looking to do lease negotiations in the next 12 months. I think if you're Paul feeding that, you're going to say you need to contact your broker now because it takes time to set that stuff up. Inside of 6 months, so within the next 3 months. So essentially, almost 40%, a little over 40% is inside of 12 months. So, this is the time, if you're in that position, that you need to be talking to your brokers, people like me that can help you build that strategy as well. We worked actively with brokers throughout the country. So, if you're working through that process now, you should be, hopefully you've got your strategy in place and you're ready to go. With that, I think we'll focus on kind of the last couple of questions we got for the panelists today, which is really focused on opportunities of the future. I think we've done a good job of talking about trends, talking about market conditions, some great advice for tenants as they're looking forward, both from a design perspective and use perspective. But this is a time where we ask the panelists to look into that crystal ball and say, what do you expect in the future? What's coming? And so let's start that with Jonathan, and then I'll just go around the horn, but make it, Jonathan, let's keep these questions, within a short response, and then we can get to some Q&A here in a little bit. So let's start with Jonathan on that. What's the crystal ball say?
Yeah, my crystal ball's broken, but I'm an optimist, and as a designer, as an architect, I can't help but be an optimist. Our cities and our cities are going to be in a tough time here. This is a real reset in the way we think about why do downtowns exist? Why do we work together? What does proximity mean? How do we build culture? I mean, there are some meaty, more than generational, but like seismic shifts in the way we're thinking about the future. That leads to all kinds of uncertainty, but it leads to all kinds of amazing opportunities to plant a flag in the ground and say, this is what we believe about the future for my company. And we're committed and excited for that future that is unknown. And I think what the pandemic has taught many of us is that we don't know what the future is. And the reality is we didn't know what the future was in 2019. We don't know what the future is in 2023. But again, I mean, as an architect and a designer, I can't help but be optimistic that, through these challenges, we're going to see some real opportunities to create new futures for our cities and our companies that are going to propel whatever that next future is going to be. So I'm really excited about what that future is, but it's going to be bumpy to uncover that together.
I'm going to switch to John. I'll save Paul for last on the question, just because, if you're a tenant, you're kind of giddy right now if you're trying to do long-term lease negotiations, because the opportunities are pretty good out there. So I'll turn it to the landlord viewpoint right now. John, are you still in the tunnel with no light at the end of it, or are you starting to see a light at the end of the tunnel?
Also, ever the optimist, which has become more and more difficult as a landlord broker. Glimmers of light, possibly. Certainly, and again, we touched on this, if you're in a high quality building with good amenities, in a stronger market, you're okay. If you've got a Class B underperforming building where you haven't put in the work to the amenities yet and haven't made that investment, you're going to struggle. And how you attack that problem, whether it's by trying to catch up and add the amenities, or look at alternative uses, or getting creative, those are the questions we're seeing answered. Some people are in a better position to do it than others and will survive, but there's going to be some serious turmoil. And while we are seeing glimmers of activity like we'd like to see, it's really just starting to happen.
Got it. Okay, so Paul, just a couple of comments from you, and then I'll close us out before we go to Q&A with a couple of thoughts I have.
Sure. I'm like John and Jonathan, I am a long-term bull. Obviously, most major cities have short-term issues that they need to work through, and financing issues that they need to work through for landlords. It's the crystal ball is broken. No one foresaw March of 2020, but I am observing certainly some green shoots, as I would call them, here in San Francisco. I have a small sublease that's perfect for startups, and I've probably had 40 tours of that space. I know that Regis here in San Francisco is doing very well in terms of occupancy. WeWork is doing very well in terms of occupancy. And so folks do want to get together, and that at some point that those folks will flow out of those spaces and want to be in their own space, and the market will be ready for them because there will be opportunities there. And the last thing I'll say, and this is for all the landlords that are thinking about amenities, and do I build a bike room, and do I create showers? Let's focus on basics. Are your windows clean? I was in a building last week where it looks like the windows hadn't been cleaned in 3 years. Are the floors clean? Are all the lights working in your hallways? Are your carpets clean? Do you ever run into a day porter when you're on a tour? Those are things that also make a difference to a tenant when they're touring a property, because they can say, well, I can get a pretty good deal, but this is a pretty well-maintained property. And there aren't as many of those. And it's easy to get dazzled by the gyms and the EV chargers, et cetera. And those are all great. And tenants do like those. Tenants also want to go into a building where they feel safe, clean, and it's well-maintained. Yeah,
great points. I think I would close on that topic with just, the future. I am very optimistic, because I just think that we, as a collective in the industry, I think as a country, we're really good at innovating. And I just think cities, you're going to see cities starting to step in and try to do things to innovate, right? To drive traffic back in their downtowns. I don't know what all that looks like, but I think that's going to have to happen. And I think we're seeing some fringe ideas start to come out in San Francisco and other places. So I think that's going to keep driving. I think landlords, it's like I said before, landlords can be very creative. I think the creativeness will be bigger and better for those tenants that are credit tenants and can have capital to share in some of the cost of whatever that strategy is. So I think those are some good things coming up. And I just think that innovation is going to play a role. I don't think we see what that is yet. Trying to add that light at the end of the tunnel for John, it's not there yet, but I think it will start to materialize, and I look forward to seeing that. So with that, I think we can turn it over to just going through a couple questions. And let me just see what a couple questions are here from the audience here. So here's a pretty good question. So from the audience, what kind of collaboration spaces are you seeing that work for professional service firms? So I think this goes back to Jonathan. When you were saying you're seeing law firms try to do it, I was envisioning, a table with 5 chairs and some lawyers talking back and forth at each other. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest shift we're seeing around collaboration spaces is an understanding that maybe the best way to collaborate isn't sitting around a table with a monitor at the end, right? That we're used to now, like I can take a call sitting on my patio or sitting on my sofa. I can find a different kind of setting for that. And so the question becomes, what kind of collaboration are you doing and what do you need, right? So we have some clients who, when they're collaborating, they need technology, right? So it's how does the room, how does the furniture, how does the lighting, how does the acoustics support collaborating around that technology? For others, the way they collaborate is really like they need to talk to each other. They need to bounce ideas off of each other. So it's whiteboards, it's comfortable furniture, it's a different kind of lighting. And none of those are new solutions. They've all been around and tried and tested for a long time. But what we're seeing is a range of folks now seeing, oh, maybe collaboration doesn't either have to be in a private office or around a conference table, that there are lots of different ways in between that can happen. And then you layer into that, is that collaboration happening 100% in person, or are we collaborating with folks that are also remote? And that adds a whole nother layer about the equity of that collaboration.
Got it. Hey, John, I've got a couple questions here from the landlord side, which I think is actually pretty good. I mean, we've been talking about amenities and finishes. And so the question is, are amenities more important than investing in finishes from a landlord perspective today? You have a quick answer for that?
All things being equal, and if you're checking the boxes that Paul mentioned, where you've got a clean, a presentable, professional building, I would lean toward amenities right now, especially if you've done none and you're just trying to catch up. But probably the most effective tool to get us activity and get a space leased right now is if a landlord's willing to spec it and do something flexible and open and clean. Because a lot of these companies are coming to you having kicked the can down the road for so long. They need something in 3 months or 4 months, or maybe they're already month to month and would take it immediately. So if you've got good quality spec spaces, you can get activity on it.
Yeah, I think that was the next question, which is how, should landlords have spec space available? And I think you just answered that. So I think spec space, if you're a landlord and you have capital today, where would you spend it? Would you spend it on updating your lobby? Would you spend it on putting in a fitness room, or would you spend it on a spec space? I think you just answered that.
Yeah, every day of the week.
Got it. Well, I think with that, we're pretty much at time. Is there any other final questions from anybody or comments? I'll just open it up.
Maybe I'll start, Jeff, and just say that we have an opportunity here to experiment, right? The last 3 years have been a grand experiment. None of us know what the next 10 years are going to be, but we have an opportunity to be creative, with folks that are gathered here with other parts of that team to to try different things and to provide some structure and flexibility in deals, as John and Paul have talked about, to design spaces that can move and flex, and don't try and get the right answer that's going to be the right thing for the next 10 years, because it won't be, right? No matter how talented I am as an architect or Paul is as a broker, we're not going to get it exactly right because the world's too dynamic. And so invest in the flexibility, be creative, take advantage of the opportunities that exist now, because there's opportunities there for companies that are willing to be a little optimistic about the future.
That's great. Well, listen, I really appreciate the conversation this morning with the three of you. It's been great, and I really appreciate all the attendees that have been listening. And I think with that, I'll turn it to Amy and go from there.
All right. Thank you, Jeff, Jonathan, John, and Paul, for providing your insights to make this a great discussion. I also want to thank the audience for being engaged and submitting your questions. If we didn't have time to answer yours, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. And if you have further questions or comments, please reach out to us. We're happy to continue the conversation. And then also, if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks if you have difficulty downloading it now. And finally, here's a link to a survey for today's presentation. And thank you for joining us. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. All right. Bye-bye.